Hello, everyone. My name is Robin, and I am very excited to be here to offer some suggestions and some strategies and ideas to think about resiliency and wellness, especially for our caregivers. So, thank you so much to the organizers for allowing me this opportunity to jump in here to create a six-part series that is going to explore these ideas about your resiliency, about your wellness, about what it looks like to be a caregiver and how we can support you as you continue to support others. So, how this is going to work is we're going to talk about these segments and we're going to explore a big idea in each one of these videos. The first one being this one, we're going to talk all things resiliency. I'm going to share with you what I have come upon in my work, working in this field for over 20 years as a scholar, as an educator, as a speaker who's dive deep into resiliency and think about what we can do to make sure we are okay. The next, we're going to have an opportunity to hear from an amazing psychologist and a caregiver herself who lives and looks after her adult son with a developmental disability. I'm going to introduce you to a very dear colleague, Dr. Elaine Scarf, and she's going to talk about the psychology of a caregiver, things that she looks at from two very specific vantage points as a caregiver herself and as well as a leading psychologist. We're also going to talk about stress. We're going to talk about stress cycles. We're going to talk about stress regulation and how we make sure that you are operating in a place where you can stress wisely. And I can assure you there is a way to stress wisely. Now, the next thing that we're going to talk about is this idea about caregiver wellness redefined. Now, I appreciate there's a lot of information on wellness, but I also know that wellness is an area that many caregivers experience some challenge with those ideas of boundaries and knowing our non-negotiables and looking after our emotional health. So we're going to explore some key research-informed ideas on those topics for you. Then we're going to talk about this idea about scheduling and goals and like how do we actually create routine. So it's good to know about wellness, but I want to show you how you can actually put it into practice. So that will be one of our videos. And the last video that we're going to share in this series is this idea about authoring your own resiliency story. Each and every one of us has a resiliency story. You can do hard things. You have had all of these different experiences. And one of the pieces that we've learned about the literature is that when you find a way to review that story, when you find a way of sharing that story, when you find a way of exploring, diving deeper into really understanding what that looks like, we know that this can be a very important experience for people to be able to practice the everyday resiliency. And also it serves as a guide for others. It can serve as a guide for others if we choose to share. So thank you so much for joining me in this six-part series. Before I get into Resiliency 101, so to speak, I do just want to pause and recognize that the land in which I live upon and the land in which I'm recording these videos for you is land of the Anishinaabe First Persons of the Mississauga. And I'm a settler in this space, and I'm doing my best to learn and to listen and to be an ally. This space is also referred to Peterborough, Ontario, and I'm very grateful to be able to live here and to work here. And I give thanks, even in these darker days of winter, for those days of sunshine and the stability that comes in living in the province of Ontario. So as we jump into this Resiliency 101, as I said, I've been studying this for a very long time, and I've been working with persons all around the world thinking about resiliency. And when I started this work, my research question was pretty specific. It was actually something as straightforward as, what is the difference between somebody who gives up when life is hard and somebody who gets up? What is that difference that we just keep showing up versus the people that don't seem to have that capacity? And what I came upon in my work is that resilient persons had things in common. We actually identified 5 areas that resilient people leaned into when life was difficult. And what I want to tell you a wee bit about each one of those, because what we know is that this is how we find the capacity to make the next right decision. Now, I do think it's important to acknowledge that resiliency isn't something we're born with. It's not something we have or we don't have. Resiliency can be taught. It can be cultivated and it can be fostered. So, to get us started, what we've identified are these five variables. And the first one is a sense of belonging. It is absolutely crucial that you have a home team, that you have people in your corner that are going to support you, that you can receive support, and that you can give support. When I think about our home teams, these don't always have to be biology, these don't always have to be family. It's the people you choose to surround yourself by, that close, small group of people that know that you have their back and they have yours. Now, what's interesting is when we've explored this idea of a home team or people in your corner, especially for caregivers, we want to make sure that you're protecting your home team. And what I mean by that is if we're not careful, we can let all the pressure and the noise kind of pull us off what matters most. We get pulled into some of that negative mentality sometimes, thinking that there's a right way to do things, or we're not doing enough based on people outside of our circle. We want to make sure we're protecting our health, our emotional health, our sense of community and family. It's absolutely crucial. Now, the second variable we come upon is perspective. And perspective often gets referred to as an attitude or a mindset. And I think that's part of it, but it's not the full story. It's this idea of having your head and your heart in alignment. And sometimes the greatest deltas can be between our head and your heart. Intellectually, you might know something, but emotionally, you're not ready to feel it yet, or you're not really to let it go yet. That's completely normal. Now, what we know when we see resilient people, though, is that they have found this alignment or they work towards it. And they do that by using their value systems. What matters most to you? And how do you make what matters most matter most? Now, when I'm working with persons, I tend to see people, when we think about perspective taking, that come from two different vantage points. The first one is people who really kind of get stuck in the past. There's a lot of shame, there's a lot of regret, there's a lot of just like unanswered questions. And on the other side, I see people that are so worried forecasting the future that they need to know and try to control all of those uncertain events. And it creates a lot of fretting and a lot of anxiety. Now, when we think about resiliency as it relates to perspective, is we need you in the moment. Resiliency isn't in our past and it's not in our future. It's in the moments that we're in present. So we need to be mindful. Now, the third area that we see that resilient people have in common is this idea around acceptance. Now, I appreciate acceptance in theory is pretty straightforward. In practice, it is very hard to do. And sometimes when we feel as though something is unjust, it is very hard to accept it. And maybe we don't need to accept it. Maybe that's not what we need to focus our energy on. But what we do know is that resilient people, despite injustices and frustrations and setbacks, what they have learned what to do is that they know how to decipher their controllables, what is within their control and what is not within their control. And they make a path to where they have the agency to impact change. So it doesn't mean that you have to accept everything that's happening to you. And, it's interesting because I think one of the greatest writings that I heard about acceptance was actually by the phenomenal Canadian actor and writer, Michael J. Fox. And in his book, he explores acceptance in a meaningful way. So if you want to check out something on acceptance, his writing is very, very helpful. Now, when we think about acceptance, what I want you to think about is how do you make sure that you are navigating those pulls and those challenges in a way that isn't drawing you into the past or pushing you too forward into the future. We want to make sure that just in that moment, you recognize that you are okay. Come what may, you'll be able to figure it out. But we just want you to make sure that you're in the present moment. Now, the next variable that we talk about in my work is the idea of hope, or choosing to be hope filled. Now, where I understood this in a very, very significant way was work I had done with our Canadian forces. And I recall working with a group of soldiers who had just come home from a deployment. And I was so curious about what was on the horizon. Like, what were they looking forward to? So I asked the first soldier, and they shared with me that before their deployment, they had painted half of their kitchen, but they didn't get done. So that was what they were going to do when they had a day off. The next soldier I spoke to, they shared with me that they had laid down hardwood floor at their house, but they also only got half done. So they had this house project to think about. I thought it was very peculiar that all of the soldiers in this platoon had a half-finished house project. So I asked their lieutenant later in the day and I said, "Sir, what was that about?" And what he said was transformational. He said, "Doc, they leave half-finished projects as signs of hope for their families that they're coming home. So there's something to lean into. There's evidence that they leave on the ground that there's still work to be done here, and I will be back to do it." I asked that very weathered lieutenant next. I said, "Sir, what you're proposing means hope is a choice." And he said, "Robyne, hope will always be a choice. And if we want to be of service to others, we need to stay hope filled." So my invitation for you as caregivers, it's hard to stay hope filled all the time. It's hard. There's challenges, there's pressures, there's uncertainty. There's so many things that we can get focused on that is going to really impact our sense of hope. But as a fellow mother, my invitation for you is to think of your hope as a pilot light deep in your heart. And you know what? There's going to be bad days. There's going to be days where we just don't feel like we have that capacity to keep going. But I want you to make sure that little pilot light in your heart, it doesn't go out. You protect that wee but mighty little pilot light. And it's okay that we rest. It's okay that we have days where we're wobbly, but we don't quit. We find a way to support the people that we love. Now, the fifth and the final variable in my work on resiliency and my theory of resiliency is this idea of humor. Now, humor is interesting because often when things are difficult, humor is like the last thing that people are thinking about. But what we know is humor has a role. It serves a purpose in the bigger picture of resiliency. It gives us a moment to catch our breath. It gives us a moment to have a little bit of reprieve. So we know that humor and laughter and joy, merriment, are all very important things to focus on. And one of the things that I'm excited for you to meet Dr. Elaine Scarf is she'll talk about this as a mother who sees moments of merriment and joy being a parent to an adult child with a disability. And I'm excited for you to hear her perspective because it is deeply embedded in this idea about we find those moments, and those moments are what we string together so we can keep making good choices. Now, we also know our biology backs this up. So for example, when you laugh or find moments of merriment, your body releases a natural tranquilizer. So for a moment in time, your pain receptors are blocked, which it gives you a moment to catch your breath. It helps to bring you back to the present moment and maintain perspective. Now, one of the fascinating mysteries of the human body is we come preloaded with many chemicals that help us through difficult seasons. When we think about, our endorphins, when we think about serotonin, when we think about, even oxytocin, when we think about, our dopamine, when those things can be released when we have those little moments. So finding ways to be able to activate those. And we'll talk more about how we can do that, because I know it's not easy, especially when you're tired. And when I'm working with people right now, they're bone tired. There is a deep fatigue that has set in. And I think a lot of us as grownups and caregivers, we were tired before COVID, but we have hit a whole other level of this deep exhaustion. And we'll talk as well about how we can address that. So what I see in my program is that these 5 variables serve as a constellation of what people can lean into when things get difficult, keeping a close eye on our sense of belonging, where we feel safe, where we can experience psychological safety, being able to maintain perspective, knowing what matters most, knowing what actually matters. That idea of acceptance, realizing that will be things outside of our control, but we do have things within our control and we want to align our energy there. Choosing to stay hope-filled. And again, I know that is not an easy task, but it is a task that will bring you to a place where you can live rightly. And lastly is the humor, finding those moments of merriment, those pockets of joy, a way of being able to make the most of what you're experiencing. Now again, just to clarify, it's not saying that there's a silver lining in anything. It's that despite the storm, despite the challenges, I'm still going to find a way to protect my peace. I will not surrender my joy. So thank you for joining me thus far. I'm very excited for our next segment. So thank you. Merci, miigwech, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.